tarde, sejam bem-vindos ao Seminário Internacional de Estudos Globais, esta sessão desta segunda-feira à tarde, às 18 horas. Sejam bem-vindos, quem está aqui no Salão Nobre da Universidade Aberta e quem nos acompanha à distância, via telemática. Hoje damos as boas-vindas à professora Vogel, que passou por cá estes dias para participar em algumas conferências internacionais, nomeadamente de estudos pombalinos, de que é especialista, dedicou a maior parte da sua investigação académica à chamada propaganda pombalina a nível europeu, mas também tem-se dedicado ao estudo da história diplomática no que diz respeito às relações com o mundo islâmico, nomeadamente com o Império Otomano. A professora Vogel da Universidade de Fecha, na Alemanha, então brinda-nos com a sua presença e com a conferência sobre este tema das relações diplomáticas no quadro do Império Otomano na época moderna. E também aceitou benevolentemente moderar e coordenar esta sessão o nosso colega e investigador, Dr. Ricardo Ventura, que também tem feito um projeto de pós-doutoramento sobre a história das relações entre Portugal e o mundo otomano e, portanto, conhece também bem este período no contexto da história moderna e, portanto, aceitou moderar e fazer um comentário crítico desta sessão, a quem muito agradeço. Assim sendo, duas boas-vindas aos dois e passo a palavra ao Dr. Ricardo Ventura para, então, coordenar esta sessão. Muito obrigado.
Boa tarde a todos. Agradeço, em primeiro lugar, o convite para estar aqui. Não foi preciso ser muito benevolentemente, é com todo o gosto que estou aqui para apresentar também a conferência da professora Vogel da Universidade de Fecha e para já não teria muito mais a dizer, passaria a palavra à professora Christine, que vai passar a apresentar.
Boa tarde. I have to apologize. I'm going to speak in English. I'm sorry for that, but I first want to thank the Universidade Aberta and Professor José Eduardo Franco for welcoming me here to in this forum, and I'm very happy to be able to present to you what is a little bit a sort of overview over the what we call the new diplomatic history, focusing on the Ottoman Empire. Because for the past 10-15 years, we have had a renewal in diplomatic history and also in Ottoman history, and I'm going to present an overview of that to you tonight. So, diplomacy and the Islamic world in the early modern period. The case of the Ottoman Empire, which is at the same time not only a special case, but also a paradigmatic case for the new global history of diplomacy. Because what we've done in the past 10-15 years is to challenge the traditional Eurocentric master narrative of the invention of modern diplomacy in Renaissance Italy, from where it spread to Europe, from where it spread to the rest of the world. For a couple of years now, we've done a lot of research to revise this overly simplistic view of the modern diplomacy. And Istanbul is a very good case in point, because by the 16th century at the latest, it had become, in fact, a hub of early modern diplomacy that radiated to points far beyond Europe. The capital of the Ottoman Empire, which stretched over 3 continents, was a gateway for east-west trade and communication routes, and thus at the same time an important site of transcultural integration and cross-border politics. If there was anything like a diplomatic world capital in the early modern era, It was arguably Istanbul much rather than Vienna or Versailles, as has been claimed by traditional diplomatic history. In any case, the capital of the Ottoman Empire was a dynamic testing ground for transcultural diplomatic procedures and practices which provided essential impulses to the development of modern diplomacy. So, and I'm trying to the methodological and conceptual innovations that have been developed in recent years, including global historical and praxeological approaches to historical research, they have radically changed our focus on the Ottoman Empire and on Ottoman diplomacy. Previously, historians frequently struggled to plausibly integrate what was sometimes called the Muslim colossus at the border, at the edge of Europe, into this Eurocentric master narrative of the parallel formation of the international state system and modern diplomacy. In most cases, this was due to the assumption of supposedly irreconcilable cultural differences between Ottomans and Europeans. Meanwhile, for all the differences in the social and political organization, research stresses the structural similarities of political cultures, the adaptability of imperial elites, and the manifold social, economic, and political interdependencies in a Mediterranean and Southeast European world that was shared by Ottomans and Europeans. The fact that Ottoman diplomacy was considered for such a long time from the European point of view to be at least unconventional also had largely to do with the imperial self-understanding of the empire. Since the conquest of Constantinople by Mehmed II, the Ottoman Empire saw itself as the heir to Rome, which was reflected in the diplomatic ceremony at the Sultan's court. In the competition with the Persian Safavids in the east and the Habsburgs in the west, the Ottoman dynasty's claim to world domination was consolidated in the 16th century under the Sultan Selim I and Suleiman I. And under these two sultans, the Ottoman claim of world domination also assumed a religious dimension. The Ottomans' idea of imperial rule found its sacred legitimation in Islamic law, although they were keen to manage relations with Christian powers not only by military force, but also diplomatically. In fact, both Ottomans and Europeans in the early modern period pursued a pragmatic approach in shaping their foreign relations. Religion certainly played a decisive role here, but it was by no means an exclusive role. Like their Christian counterparts, the Ottoman sultans relied above all on a strategy of dynastic preservation of power and territorial expansion, whereby treaties with non-Muslim rulers were dictated by reason, or raison d'etat. Countless peace and trade agreements between Ottomans and Europeans attest to the intensity of diplomatic relations. These treaties were the result of an overlapping of Islamic legal norms with Sultan law, Byzantine traditions, and diverse local customary laws, as well as Western European ideas of precedence and jus gentium. A glance then at diplomatic treaties and negotiations between Ottomans and Europeans makes one thing abundantly clear. At least for the early modern period, the concept of westernization, conceived as a process of unidirectional cultural transfer, does not represent an adequate approach to understanding Ottoman diplomacy. A stronger and increasingly one-sided orientation towards Latin European international law norms and procedures on the part of the Ottoman Empire can be established only at the very end of the 18th century. At this time, the empire under the Sultan Selim III began to dispatch permanent resident ambassadors to European capitals according to the Western European model. Until then, the diplomatic ties between Ottomans and Europeans were characterized by a variety of transcultural processes and practices whose primary stage was Istanbul. And as you can see, I will try to give an overview over these practices and processes, starting with laying out some fundamental aspects of Ottoman European diplomacy, and then I will turn to look at the diplomatic ceremony in more detail, and in a third part I will look at practices of diplomacy which were actually transcultural practices. Right. So, starting with varieties of European diplomacy in Istanbul. This European diplomacy was not the only one. Of course, there was also Asian diplomats present at the Ottoman court, African diplomats, but I will focus on European Ottoman relations tonight. So, this European diplomacy was typified by plurality and competition. After all, the emissaries of the various European powers operated under very different conditions, at least until the end of the 17th century. Their status, scope of action, freedom of movement, and even the location of their residence within the capital was determined by the relationship between their patron and the Ottoman ruler. Two models of European diplomacy can be distinguished as ideal types in Istanbul before the 18th century, depending on their function and their historical development. First, the Western European model of representation was based on the historical precedent of the Venetian bailo, who had a dual function as an ambassador and a consul. And the second model is the Eastern European model, which was characterized by official high-level embassies for special occasions, whereas everyday business was handled by simple residents without a particular ceremonial status. After 1700, the boundaries between the two models began to blur. The Western European model is the first thing I'm going to explain now. So the Western European trading powers, which were essentially Venice, France, England, and the Netherlands, negotiated so-called capitulations with the Sultan, which regulated the legal status of their subjects living in the Ottoman Empire and defined the rights and duties of their ambassadors. Under the protection of the capitulations, privileged Western European trading colonies constituted themselves in the Ottoman port cities. In contemporary European usage, for example, one spoke of the French nation of Istanbul or the English nation of Algiers or of any other Ottoman port city of the time. The members of a nation were exempt from the head tax that was normally due to be paid by non-Muslim subjects of the sultans. So by this exemption, they were distinguished from the sultan subjects. But with those subjects, they often shared, for instance, churches or schools. In addition, they enjoyed customs and judicial privileges and other special rights, which were set out in detail in the respective capitulations. While Venice had already received capitulations from Mehmed II in 1454, France was the first Christian monarchy to negotiate its own capitulations in 1569. England and the Netherlands followed in 1580 and 1612 respectively. In the 17th and 18th century, the regular renewal and expansion of the capitulations and the monitoring of their compliance represented a main sphere of activity of the Western European diplomats in Istanbul. The negotiations were marked by intra-European competition for the most favorable conditions for the Levant trade, but they not only concerned economic policy. Questions of precedence and religious questions were also negotiated in the context of the capitulation renewals. And in addition, the Western European powers at the Sublime Porte always pursued also power political goals. Under the legal umbrella of the capitulations, the Western European ambassadors acted as the responsible contacts for the Ottoman government in all matters concerning members of their nation, but also the political relationships with their patrons. This entailed not only extensive judicial, police, administrative, and fiscal rights, but also tax privileges and immunities for the ambassadors themselves and for their households. The capitulations thus provided European trading nations in the Ottoman Empire with something like an extraterritorial status. The permanent residence of the Western European diplomats in Istanbul was just as much due to the Islamic immigration law and the Mediterranean consular function, which dated back to antiquity, as to the newly established diplomatic customs within the Latin Christian princely society. The Western European representatives in Istanbul retained their characteristic dual function as ambassadors and consuls throughout the early modern period. In the case of France and England, this was evident not least in the financing model. For instance, the English ambassador was paid by the Levant Company until the end of the 18th century and not by the king. And the French received half of their gratuities directly from the Chamber of Commerce of Marseille. This did not change the fact that both crowns, just like Venice, gave their representatives at the Sultan's court the diplomatic rank of an ambassador, which was the highest rank available at the time. However, there was considerable potential for conflict between both the European diplomats on the ground and in relation to the Ottomans. One reason for this is the fact that in the European practice of international law of the early modern period, the notion of different diplomatic ranks was intertwined with a complicated order of precedence, and the function of ambassadeur in this context directly alluded to the delegating monarch's claim to sovereignty. So it was a highly political issue within Europe, the question of the ceremony. The Western European ambassadors resided in the vineyards of Pira above Galata, and you can see it on the map on the old imprint that dates from the 17th century. It's on the right hand, and on the satellite picture is oriented towards the north. This is Pira, as they called it at the time, or Galata, and it's today's district of Beyoğlu in Istanbul. And this was in close company. So there were the European ambassadors, and they were in close proximity to their trading compatriots. They all lived on this side of the Golden Horn. The close entanglement of trade and politics explains why the European Embassy District was built at this place. It was located far away from the palaces of the Sultan and the Grand Vizier, which were as you can see, the Topkapi Palace on the other side of the Golden Horn. So boat transfers were necessary to establish contact with the officials. But they were in Pira nonetheless, because this was tradition. A Genoese trading colony had already been established on this side of the Golden Horn in Byzantine times. And after the Ottoman conquest, the hitherto autonomous Italian municipality was integrated into the new administrative structures of the Ottoman capital and developed into the multicultural center of long-distance trade and diplomacy. With its port district, markets, taverns, and other relevant establishments, it soon acquired in the Ottoman Empire the at once dubious and alluring reputation of a Frankish cesspool of sin. Christians, however, formed only a minority among the inhabitants of this district in the early modern period. At the turn of the 16th and 17th centuries, a small Catholic community of long-established Italian families, which had been recognized by the Sultan as the Magnifica Comunità di Pera, since the 15th century already, comprised only about 24 families, so only a few hundred individuals. The majority of the inhabitants of Pera were Armenian, Greek, Jewish, and Muslim subjects of the Sultan, who lived and worked here side by side with a small number of members of the Western European trading colonies, and perhaps a few thousand Christian slaves. From the middle of the 16th century, more and more Spanish Moriscos settled, who fled to the Ottoman Empire to escape persecution under Philip II. And from 1600, the majority of the population of Pera was already Muslim. Nonetheless, neither the confessional, ethnic, linguistic, or social boundaries here were congruent, impermeable, or easy to define. In early modern Istanbul, there were denominatorially or ethnically determined residential neighborhoods, yet there was no strict separation of the population in the sense of ghettos as we know from European towns of that period. The Western embassies stood in close proximity to each other. The Venetian and French embassies even shared a small door, so one could get easily from one to the other. In the neighborhood, however, there were also private residences of wealthy Ottoman renegades. There was a mosque, a hammam, a dervish convent, and the Galata Palace School. So Galata and Pera were not just a European embassy district, but what research has labeled an urban middle ground, a site of cross-border encounter, cross-cultural interaction. So this is a view from the Dutch embassy at Pera to the other side of the Golden Horn where the palace of the Sultan was situated. And this is very typical because all the Western embassies were built like this, so it was like a stage from where they could watch the Sultan, and the Sultan could watch the European embassies on the other side of the river. These embassies were centers of multicultural sociability, trans-imperial networking, and social permeability. The strengths of all those personal networks which came together here were indispensable for the day-to-day business of diplomacy. Their quality and scope could decide on a mission's success or failure. The embassy buildings were located in the heart of the multicultural milieu. They housed not only the ambassador and his family, but also their entire household, often consisting of several dozen people, and the diplomatic staff, which was not always strictly separated from it. The French ambassador Pierre Girardin, for instance, arrived in 1685 with more than 50 servants, including secretaries, bellboys, stable boys, footmen, sedan bearers, valets, and maids for himself and his wife, but also cooks, gardeners, and an upholsterer and a tailor. Further servants were usually recruited locally. Likewise, belonging to the permanent inhabitants of the Palais de France were some Janissaries, and since the late 17th century, the so-called jeunes de langue. These boys, selected for the study of the Oriental languages, would often later work as royal interpreters in the Levant. Many other residents could be added to this list, who only temporarily took up quarters in the palace. Transient cavaliers, freed slaves, hold-up Ottoman dignitaries, artists, and explorers. There is a famous testimony of Lady Mary Wortley Montagu, who was the wife of the British ambassador in Istanbul at the beginning of the 18th century, and this quotation shows that the French embassy was no exception at all in this regard. So she writes in one of her famous letters from Istanbul, and I quote, "I live in a place that very well resembles the Tower of Babel. In Pera, they speak Turkish, Greek, Hebrew, Armenian, Arabic, Persian, Russian, Slavonian, Wallachian, German, Dutch, French, English, Italian, Hungarian. And what is worse, there are 10 of these languages spoken in my own family." My grooms are Arabs, my footmen French, English and Germans. My nurse is an Armenian, my housemaid's Russian, half a dozen other servants Greeks, my steward an Italian, my janissaries Turks. And I live in perpetual hearing of this medley of sounds, which produces a very extraordinary effect upon the people that are born here. They learn all these languages at the same time and without knowing any of them well enough to write or read it. So that was the impression that she gave from her British embassy. We have a ground plan from the beginning of the 18th century that shows the French embassy building and all that is the whole complex, and that you can see here. So we see that the Palais de France was built on a terraced sloping surface, and it was the equivalent of a little over 1 hectare. The accompanying description in this documentation, which is held in the diplomatic archives in Nantes, lists residential and reception rooms, courtyards and gardens, stables, washrooms and kitchens, as well as chancery and infirmary, a chapel, classrooms, and a Capuchin convent directly adjacent to the embassy. The embassy's reception hall was designed to give guests a view of the Sultan's palace on the opposite bank of the Golden Horn. The complex architectural structure of the Palais de France reflects the multifunctionality of European embassies as official residences and centers of diplomatic sociability and of transcultural networking. In the more formal rooms, there were diplomatic negotiations, as well as the courtesy visits and return visits which the Christian ambassadors paid each other on arrival and departure, according to European diplomatic protocol. The ambassador also received selected members of his nation and the multicultural upper class of the quarter of Pera for banquets or on special occasions. The guest lists of the Istanbul embassies always reflected the current European lines of conflict. For instance, when there was a war between France and Britain, obviously they didn't invite each other during this time. Nonetheless, the embassy palace served more than these official and representative purposes. It also formed the social, administrative, economic, and cultural center for the respective nation. It was a place where information was gathered, meetings of the nations were held, speakers were elected, disputes were settled, passports were issued, posts were given, travelers were received, petitions were delivered, but also parties, gatherings, theater performances, and competitions were organized. Not only did the members of one's own nation come together here, but often there were other Europeans and also subjects of the Sultan. When in doubt about the guest list, the decisive factor was not religious affiliation, but social status. Ample testimony shows that European ambassadors, and possibly also their wives, received Ottoman officials in their palaces and paid reciprocal visits. And they also debated with Muslim scholars and met with delegates of Armenian or Greek Christians. It's called sort of cultural diplomacy. Although it is not as well documented, similar encounters probably have taken place also on the lower social ranks within the staff of the diplomats. By contrast, and now I'm coming to the Eastern European model. By contrast, the Central and Eastern European diplomats first acted in Istanbul under quite different circumstances and conditions than their Western European counterparts. This was because the relationship of their principals to the Ottoman Empire in the 16th and 17th centuries was largely marked by war. In the course of the Ottoman expansion into southeastern Europe, the defeated princes were given the ranks of vassals or tributary states. Or, as with the Habsburgs, or the Vienna Habsburgs, at least, they were treated analogously. The ceasefire and peace treaties with the Ottomans included the obligation to maintain a diplomatic resident in Istanbul. Since the Habsburg-Ottoman peace treaty of 1547, there was accordingly a Habsburg resident in the Ottoman capital. The main function was the ceremonial, there was a representative in Istanbul, but he had no particular diplomatic rank. But there were also special envoys from Vienna regularly arriving in the Ottoman capital, and those special envoys were always very rich and had a high representative function. And their main function was the ceremonial handing over of the monetary payments agreed upon in the peace treaty. Contemporaries, as well as later historians, disputed whether these payments were actually tributes or honorary gifts. Although since 1606 there was an armistice which effectively ended the Habsburgs' tribute obligation to the Ottomans, they continued to adhere to this form of double diplomatic representation. They were represented by a low-ranking imperial resident for day-to-day diplomatic business, but also by occasional and particularly magnificent and high-ranking embassies. For the emperor in Vienna, this arrangement made perfect sense. It was appropriate given the imperial rivalry between the Habsburgs and the Ottomans, and in the context of the European notions of diplomatic representation. A unilateral, high-ranking diplomatic representation at the Sultan's court, like France had, for instance, would not have been compatible with the emperor's own universal claim to power. Finally, it was also useful in view of the intra-European rivalry. A special envoy like Wolfgang Graf zu Oettingen-Wallerstein, who entered Istanbul with great pomp as imperial representative in February 1700 to seal the Treaty of Karlowitz, was able to claim the distinguished rank of an ambassadeur extraordinaire, according to the European order of precedence. The French ambassador, who was always in concurrence, in competition with the Habsburg one, traditionally claimed the first place among all Christian diplomats in Istanbul. And he was obviously displeased by the appearance of the Count of Oettingen-Wallerstein. But as a resident ambassador, he was only an ambassadeur ordinaire, not extraordinaire, like the Habsburg. And so his king, Louis XIV, the Sun King, gave him explicit instructions to avoid any encounters with Oettingen-Wallerstein. In structural terms, the Habsburg diplomatic presence in Istanbul therefore continued long after their tribute obligation to resemble how Ottomans shaped diplomatic relations with their European tributary states. For instance, the principalities of Transylvania, Moldavia, and Wallachia, as well as the Islamic Crimean Khanate, were not only obliged to send diplomatic delegations every year to present the tribute payments to the Sultan's court, but also to permanently station a representative in Istanbul. And this representative was simultaneously the contact person for the Ottoman government and also a potential captive. And just like the representatives of the tributary state, the Habsburg residents were initially housed in the El Cihan, which was a special accommodation for foreign diplomats near Topkapi Saray, so on the same bank as the Sultan's palace, on the opposite bank as the Western European diplomats. And as a rule, the Eastern European and the Habsburg diplomats remained excluded from the everyday low-threshold practices of diplomatic sociability that were cultivated on the other bank of the Golden Horn by the Western European representatives in Pera. As a rule, they remained distant from it, both because of their spatial distance, of course, but also for reasons of rank and power politics. This spatial separation and And at the same time, the differentiation in rank between Eastern European residents on the one bank and the Western European ambassadors in Pera was already seen by the contemporaries in the early modern period as an intentional move by the Ottomans. It enabled tighter control of the Habsburgs' diplomatic activities and, moreover, brought them closer to the dependent tributary states, if only symbolically. The Western European diplomats, on the other hand, were in principle recognized as representatives of sovereign powers and accordingly enjoyed far greater freedoms in remote Pera. Nonetheless, since the category of sovereignty was anchored in European international law and not in the legal understanding of the Ottomans, this interpretation was problematic, at the least. Whether by design or simply as a historical coincidence, the obvious spatial separation of Western and Eastern European diplomats in Istanbul in the 16th and 17th centuries also marked a functional and symbolic differentiation between two varieties of Ottoman diplomacy, European diplomacy in the Ottoman capital. It was not until after the power political balance shifted in southeastern Europe in favor of the Habsburgs and their allies in the wake of the Treaty of Karlowitz around 1700, and it was not before also the Russian Tsarist Empire appeared on the scene as a new and very powerful actor that the functional and symbolical boundaries between East and West European diplomacy in Istanbul increasingly blurred. There were more frequent consultations and joint interventions among European diplomats. Something like a European diplomatic corps developed in which Western European norms progressively molded diplomatic practice. It remains debatable, however, whether all this is sufficient to speak of a westernization of the diplomatic practice in Istanbul before the late 18th century, particularly since an essential impulse for these developments came from the Russian Tsardom. Nevertheless, the rapprochement and increasing joint agreements between the diplomats of Western and Eastern Europe on the ground made it possible to appear more united vis-à-vis the Ottoman interlocutors and thereby generate more pressure to negotiate. The functional differentiation of the two European diplomacy models became gradually obsolete, at least in the course of the late 18th century. This unification of diplomatic practice in Istanbul became outwardly visible, among other things, in the fact that in the course of the 18th century, not only the Habsburg and the Polish representatives, but also all new European ambassadors that arrived then, for example, from Russia, Sweden, or Prussia, settled in Pera. But unlike their French and English counterparts, they did not monitor any trading colonies and they did not perform any consular functions. So after this overview for the two models of European diplomacy, I like to talk about the diplomatic ceremonies in Istanbul. And we can say that within the framework of the Ottoman Sultan's imperial strategy, the reception of foreign diplomats played a central role. The diplomatic ceremony was the medium through which the Ottomans symbolically asserted their claim to world domination and staged themselves as otherworldly religious rulers. And in this context, two events played a prominent role: public audiences and gift giving. The urban space of the Ottoman capital of Istanbul was an integral part of the reception ceremonies for foreign representatives. Istanbul and the Topkapi Palace, built by Mehmed II on the headland between the Golden Horn and the Sea of Marmara, served as a stage, while residents and visitors played the important role of spectators. They lined streets and squares where the emissaries of Asian, European, and African rulers moved in solemn procession with a large cohort and valuable gifts along the central boulevard. right into the Topkapi Palace. It was almost impossible to tell from the outside whether it was the freely sent delegation of a sovereign ruler or the forced homage of a defeated tributary. On their way to the Sultan, they all had to cross various architectural and ceremonial thresholds in a prescribed manner before reaching the Gate of Felicity. This was the third and last gate to the strictly shielded innermost part of the vast palace of Topkapi. Once there, the guests were dressed in honorary robes, which symbolically integrated them into the Ottoman world order. They were then led into the audience chamber directly behind the gate to kiss the Sultan's skirt, as it was soon expressed metonymically in European reports. And on this slide, you can see it on the right-hand side, is the scene inside the audience chamber, the reception, the audience of a Dutch ambassador in the late 17th century. He's hardly recognizable because he is dressed in this honorary robe, the Ottoman dress. The only way to recognize him is by his headgear. In fact, the Christian ambassadors were held by the arms by two servants of the Sultan and more or less gently brought to a kneeling position before the Sultan. So that in the center of the capital, of the Ottoman capital, and in the very heart of the palace, they gained a view of the empire's incarnate center of power. Here, the Sultan, surrounded by his highest ranking servants and most important dignitaries, appeared on his throne in motionless silence as the Sultan of Sultans, the crown giver of the earth, the ruler of the countries of the Rum, the Persians and the Arabs, the hero of the cosmos, the shadow of God on earth. And these are some of his official titles that he used, for instance, in letters addressed to the Habsburg Emperor. The Ottoman reception ceremony, therefore, was the ultimate symbolic staging of world domination. It corresponded to a self-understanding according to which there could actually be no such thing as foreign relations, because there was no exterior to this imperial claim. A closer look, however, reveals that the diplomatic ceremony was by no means inflexible. Although little changed overall in the course of in the course of the centuries regarding the reception ceremonies, some details could very well vary considerably. For instance, the length of waiting times, the positions in the room, the size of the entourage, the splendor of the decorations, and the type and extent of gifts that were exchanged on the occasion. The Europeans translated all this and much more into the language of their own order of precedence and negotiated closely with the Ottoman interlocutors in the run-up to the ceremonies. Intensive discussions took place through various official and informal channels even before a diplomatic representative was officially received and accredited. Moreover, the reception at the Sultan was simply the last and most magnificent stage of the complex Ottoman reception ceremonial, which sometimes stretched over weeks. Because prior to the reception at the Sultan's palace, there were also other steps. The emissary had to be welcomed by the Grand Vizier in a solemn audience, and also by other dignitaries. And all these ceremonies were negotiated beforehand in every detail. And yet, any one particular ceremony could give rise to disputes and disagreeable incidents. For example, when the French ambassador Charles de Montel appeared in May 1677 for an inaugural audience at the Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa Pasha, he left the audience chamber under protest before the Grand Vizier's arrival because he did not agree with the intended seating arrangement. And some 20 years later, his successor, Charles de Ferriol, provoked a loud brawl in the middle of Topkapi Palace while the Sultan was already in the audience chamber and heard everything, because he insisted on entering the audience chamber with his sword on, and this was forbidden by the law in the Ottoman Empire. No one could approach the Sultan with a weapon. So Charles de Ferriol left the palace without an audience. These and other ritual conflicts were long attributed to the lack of intercultural competence on the part of the involved actors. They were accordingly interpreted as cultural misunderstandings and thus underpinning the thesis of a supposedly fundamental incompatibility of the political systems of meaning. Today, however, such incidents are being examined using the methods of historical ritual research, and just like intra-European ritual conflicts that abundant also in the early modern period, they are analyzed as targeted attempts to assert political claims of power in the precise historical context. So the reception, the audience, is one important aspect of the ceremony, and the exchange of gifts is the other important aspect. The issue of gifts was a central and also a particularly conflict-ridden aspect of the diplomatic ceremony at the Sultan's court. As already mentioned, vassal states and enemies defeated in war had to deliver their tribute payments, called honorary gifts, every year. But even the ambassadors of the Western European trading powers had to hand out gifts to the Sultan, the highest dignitaries, and also the servants during their inaugural audiences, according to precisely regulated procedures and to a previously negotiated extent. In general, the Ottomans already defined the establishment of diplomatic relations in the language of giving and receiving gifts. Peace, the Sultan let the Western sovereigns know, was only possible between friends, and friendship was established through gifts. Therefore, a prerequisite for the granting of capitulations for the Western trading nations was a written request for friendship from a ruler, accompanied by suitable offerings. Both the Sultan's court and the Western embassies in Istanbul had detailed gift registers drawn up, like the one that you see on this slide, which comes from the French archives. And for each side, it was not only a matter of documenting the material value of the gifts, but also maintaining a list of precedents. The Western gift registers usually distinguished carefully between so-called obligatory gifts and extraordinary gifts. Obligatory gifts were textiles distributed on the day of the audience to the Sultan and all high-ranking dignitaries and their servants down to the stable boy, each in a different quality and quantity according to the respective rank. Extraordinary gifts, on the other hand, were reserved only for the highest dignitaries. As a rule, these included valuable watches, jewelry, technological innovations such as measuring instruments, nautic instruments, etc. In this case, the ambassadors were often confronted with very specific orders from the Ottomans, which repeatedly caused irritation, since it was difficult to reconcile with European ideas of gift-giving. In return, the Ottoman diplomats received ceremonial robes of honor, as I've already mentioned before. But they had a high symbolic value and, according to Ottoman tradition, marked the recipient as subordinate. The number and quality of these vestments were regarded as an indicator of the homage paid by the Ottomans to the respective ambassadors and their patrons. And Europeans very quickly grasped this, to the point, in fact, where the claim to have received more robes of honor than any other European diplomat before them became a common topic in their reports back home. The question of robes of honor repeatedly gave rise to complicated and protracted negotiations in the run-up to ceremonies. Europeans used this element as a way of enhancing their cachet for settling internal proceedings, disputes. So, diplomatic gift-giving in Istanbul was embedded in the very specific and ritualized Ottoman economy of giving. obligatory honorary gifts for assuming office or for regularly recurring appointments had a fixed place in Ottoman culture and formed a separate category of gifts as part of rituals of investiture. And these gifts were called pikses in the Ottoman language. Moreover, they had to be presented by European diplomats not only to the highest dignitaries like the Sultan or the Vizier, but also to all other officials with whom they had dealings, such as clerks or customs officers. Gifts therefore represented a significant cost factor in the ambassador's budget and led to repeated complaints, particularly as Europeans could not expect any consideration in return for this type of gift, other than that the officials were actually doing their jobs. And for this reason, individual European diplomats repeatedly attempted to persuade their counterparts to take concerted action against the costly and dishonorable practice of gift giving. But they usually failed, owing to intra-European competition. So gift giving, of course, is also already a transcultural practice. But the European diplomacy in Istanbul encompassed a broad spectrum of different actors and a continuum of practices. These practices range from ritualized and highly formalized official meetings as the ceremonies, but they also comprised informal meetings and up to secret meetings. Usually, the higher the social rank of the participants and the greater the publicity of their interaction, the more the competing imperial claims of Europeans and Ottomans shape the form and structure of the exchange. The multicultural setting of the Ottoman capital influenced the diplomatic practice as much as the city's unique topography, in which spatial proximity or distance always had a figurative dimension. Yet, diplomatic practice in Istanbul was by no means a one-way street, even if the Ottomans were those who initially set the local parameters. In everyday interaction, the rules of the game were repeatedly renegotiated, boundaries were shifted and crossed. In order to deal with the daily business of diplomacy, there were a multitude of actors in action, only a few of whom held official positions. Activities ranged from negotiating the course of official diplomatic ceremonies and the context and the content of treaties and agreements to initiating and resolving conflicts, gathering information, or spreading disinformation. The solemn meeting between the ambassador and the Sultan, or even the Grand Vizier in a public audience, was only the tip of the iceberg. Day-to-day business was conducted through various channels, some official and public, some informal and secret. However, the diplomatic ritual was constitutive to the extent that in the complex field of diplomatic practice in early modern Istanbul, it delimited the area of official interaction. All the actors who had been formally introduced to each other according to the rules of the diplomatic ritual were then able to interact with each other. And in this sense, the ritual served to make the group of official diplomatic actors visible. On the Ottoman side, these official actors included, in addition to the Sultan and the Grand Vizier, those dignitaries to whom the ambassador paid his solemn respects in public audiences when he assumed office. And this group of people on the Ottoman side varied during the early modern period. Could be the Kaymakam, the deputy of the Grand Vizier, but there were also other dignitaries who assumed a role in the diplomacy, in the Ottoman diplomacy over the course of the centuries. Even the Shaykh al-Islam, the supreme Islamic legal scholar of the empire, played a certain role in this context. But the most important intermediaries for the Ottoman European diplomacy were certainly the dragomans. They were the officially appointed interpreters who worked both at the Sultan's court and at the embassies. They not only appeared in diplomatic ceremonies, but were also present in practically every conversation between Ottomans and Europeans. And on this painting, which is also from the late 17th century, we can see the interpreters, they are easily recognizable by their headwear. If you look in the center of this painting, you see that the European diplomat is shown from the back, and he is seated in front of his Ottoman counterpart, who is the Grand Vizier in this case. And on the right and the left, there are two people with brown headgear, and those are the dragomans. So these people were omnipresent, and they had also representative functions and could also negotiate, sometimes on their own account, if they had if they were trusted enough by their patrons. And last aspect, which is important to understand how diplomacy functions as transcultural practice, is the networking. So how do actually all these different actors, from the officials and office holders to the dragomans and also the members of the household of the ambassador, how do they relate to each other, and how do these networks actually, how are they established to work for a diplomatic practice on a day-to-day level? And it is important to realize or to consider that just as at the Christian princely courts in Europe, the actual political power was not maybe with those who held the official titles, no? And at the Sultan's court, it did not always lie with the Grand Vizier, but there were sometimes other informal actors who were the most powerful. Therefore, it was important for the Western diplomats to identify and come into contact not only with their official interlocutors, but also with other relevant and politically influential persons at the Sultan's court. For example, this might include the Sultan's mothers, who were at times particularly politically influential, or high-ranking palace servants from the insulated interior of the Topkapi Palace. Not unlike in Vienna and Versailles, the establishment of an efficient network was therefore also in early modern Istanbul the prerequisite for successful diplomatic work. And here as there, kinship, friendship, and patronage were the basic modes of social networking and confidence building. But the underlying conditions and the rules of social interactions, of course, in this multicultural setting of the Ottoman capital, differed considerably from the customs at the Christian courts of Europe. On the other hand, the location also offered a particularly large and diverse reservoir of potential informants, spies, and mediators of contacts between Western ambassadors and Ottoman dignitaries. And what I'm showing you here in this slide is just an example for the diplomatic network of one particular French ambassador who is called Pierre Girardin. You can see his name in the middle. And this is a very simplified model of his diplomatic networks, showing in red, in the red color, the patronage networks, where he is himself a client of the French minister Colbert, in Versailles, and the whole Colbert clan. You can see who had the different posts of secretaries of state in Versailles and were actually the powerful persons for this topic. But he also had his own clients in Istanbul, and one of the most important was Jean-Baptiste Fabre, who was a merchant, a French merchant of the trading nation. And through this Jean-Baptiste Fabre, he had managed to establish relations with some highest-ranking Ottoman dignitaries. The relations in green are kinship relations. So Pierre Girardin had his brother based in Marseille and Toulon, where was the economic center of the French Levant trade. And Jean-Baptiste Fabre, who is a central figure of the French nation in Istanbul, was married to a Greek woman who was a subject of the Sultan. And through this relation, he had special contact with Alexandros Mavrokordatos, who was the chief dragoman of the Ottoman Sultan. So you see that through this kind of networking, the actual day-to-day diplomatic practice really functioned. And to establish this networking and this patronage, one of the most important means to do so was, again, gift giving. But this time, another kind of gift giving. It was not a gift giving where the gift in itself was important and the gift or the price of the gift didn't play the decisive role, but it was the symbolic act of giving. And these gifts had also a special name in the Ottoman context that was distinguished by the gifts that were given to office holders on particular occasions. These were informal gifts. They were there to establish a relationship between two individuals and to establish trust on which one could then build to really then get to work in terms of diplomatic negotiation. And this type of gift giving had a significance for diplomatic practice that we can hardly overestimate. But at the same time, it is often very difficult to grasp in the documentation and in the sources because it is a very informal thing. And there's also a transition to corruption, obviously. So unlike the obligatory gifts to dignitaries, this category of gifts did not primarily depend on the material value, but on the gesture of giving itself. Often those were consumer goods, for instance, like embroidered handkerchiefs, exotic food, scented water, pharmaceuticals, etc. And the context established in this way could reach really to the very proximity of the Sultan and be more important than the official side of the diplomatic interaction. So, to conclude, at the end of the 17th century, there was a long-standing English embassy secretary called Paul Rickett, who has abundantly written about his experience in the Ottoman Empire, and his book became a bestseller in Europe. And in this book, he tells his European readers, although he himself has worked and lived for about 20 years in the Ottoman Empire, he tells him that the Turks were not capable of true friendship with Europeans. The authors of the relevant treatise literature in the 17th and 18th centuries, like Rickett, they left no doubt that the ambassador post in Istanbul was a horrible thing. Whoever was sent to the Sultan's court by his prince must in any case be prepared for, and I quote Rickett, the tyranny and pride of the Turks and for humiliation and insults of all kinds. Since the 17th century at the latest, the official diplomatic correspondence also repeatedly employed the topos of Oriental despotism and thus operated within the discourse field of the Turkish fear. There is much to suggest that this discourse of otherness was an effective means for European diplomats to compensate for the symbolic humiliations that they had to endure during the reception ceremony at the Sultan's court. It was only when the Ottomans were branded as barbarians and thus excluded from the circle of civilized peoples that the symbolic practices at the Sultan's court could be reconciled with the sense of honor of European princely society on the one hand, and the doctrine of sovereignty that prevailed in Europe on the other. Nonetheless, the discursive demarcation should not obscure the fact that on the level of interaction, Ottoman-European diplomacy functioned for centuries. Moreover, a set of transcultural practices developed in the urban space of the Ottoman capital that ensured communication across cultural, confessional, and linguistic borders. For diplomatic practice in Istanbul, the people who mediated as border crossers between the religions, languages, and competing empires of Habsburg, Venetians, and Ottomans fulfilled a critical function. In recent research, the term trans-imperial subjects has been coined to emphasize that these individuals traverse political, linguistic, and also religious confessional boundaries through mobility, kinship, or patronage relationships. And at the same time, they contributed to their institutional consolidation by drawing on their expertise to negotiate the foreign and their own otherness in the imperial space. As institutionalized members and mediators in the Ottoman European diplomacy, for instance, the dragomans, the official translators, they were paradigmatic trans-imperial subjects. But there were also countless informal actors who shaped the multicultural environment of the European embassies in Istanbul. Freed slaves, converts, merchants, and certainly the Jews who, because of their trans-imperial kinship networks, were quite prevalent in diplomatic contexts. To a certain extent, however, this definition ultimately applies to all diplomatic actors in Istanbul, right up to the highest-ranking ambassadors, at least in their communication with their courtly patrons at home in Versailles or in London or wherever they were. These diplomats perform precisely these roles as experts in mediation. In this respect, Ottoman European diplomacy in Istanbul as a whole presents itself as a complex of practices largely borne by trans-imperial actors. Thank you very much for your patience.
Thank you very, very much, Professor Christine Vogel, for this most interesting conference. I think I should now make a shift to Portuguese in order to make a commentary so that people who are not so familiar with English can have somehow a kind of resume of your conference, but later I will turn back to English to pose you some questions about your conference. Eu dizia então à professora Christine que ia fazer uma espécie de breve resumo crítico da conferência dela para que depois, em português, para depois colocar algumas perguntas em inglês. E para que depois também as pessoas que estão a assistir através da internet e as pessoas que estão aqui na sala possam colocar também questões que lhes tenham surgido. A conferência da professora Christine Vogel penso que será surpreendente, sobretudo para quem não esteja tão familiarizado com os avanços mais recentes da historiografia sobre as relações entre a Europa e o Império Otomano, e em particular em relação aos estudos sobre a diplomacia entre a Europa e o Império Otomano, porque a conferência dela parte de conquistas ou descobertas que a historiografia tem vindo a desenvolver ao longo dos últimos 20, 30 anos e que tentam libertar-se de uma visão muito centrada na visão do mundo otomano e europeu como espaços absolutamente separados que estabeleciam apenas relações de guerra e em relação aos quais não havia pontos de ligação, não havia grandes pontos de cruzamento. Nos últimos 20, 30 anos, nos anos 90, começaram a surgir alguns estudos em que começa-se a chamar a atenção para a importância de pensar a história da Europa e do Império Otomano em conjunto, dizendo que a história do Império Otomano pertence também à história da Europa e é impossível pensá-las separadamente, ou a chamar a atenção para a necessidade de pensar o Império Otomano como tendo dado um contributo fundamental para a própria ideia da Europa, não só na negativa, mas também na positiva, dando contributos para a definição de uma ideia da Europa para além de uma ideia de uma aliança de reinos cristãos. E assim também a professora Christine Vogel traz-nos aqui esta viragem historiográfica muito importante, aplicada à ideia da diplomacia, que no caso da diplomacia em Istanbul tem consequências ainda mais profundas, porque há de facto fontes, há toda uma reconstituição possível de práticas transculturais, de práticas de encontro, ainda anterior ao século XVIII, à altura em que era mais comum perceber-se que as relações entre reinos europeus e o Império Otomano se tinham, de certa forma, amenizado após o Tratado de Karlovic, em 1699, e o Império Otomano deixa de ser uma ameaça, propriamente uma ameaça tão grave, e nota-se uma certa aproximação. Ainda assim, do ponto de vista dos estudos da diplomacia, é possível perceber que ainda antes do século XVIII já havia a possibilidade de pensar estes encontros a um nível diferente que não apenas o encontro bélico. A professora Cristina apresenta-nos assim um retrato de uma atividade diplomática que não se baseia apenas nos acontecimentos traçados nos salões da corte otomana, mas que se baseia em toda uma comunidade urbana profundamente cosmopolita, provavelmente mais cosmopolita do que Viena, tal como ela diz na sua conferência, uma comunidade de estrangeiros de várias partes da Europa, do Mediterrâneo, que falam várias línguas, têm várias proveniências e que se articulam numa dinâmica transcultural de onde emerge essas funções diplomáticas. Portanto, não são só a performance do diplomata de alto estatuto, mas toda uma estrutura social que emerge dessas comunidades transculturais. Fala também de dois modelos diplomáticos que se podem distinguir. Realça muito a variedade das práticas diplomáticas em função também dos intuitos dos diversos reinos presentes, e fala de dois modelos que se pode distinguir essencialmente desta variedade, que são o modelo ocidental, que seria protagonizado pela França, a presença francesa e inglesa ligada à atividade mercantil no porto de Istanbul e noutros portos do Império Otomano, e a parte de Habsburgo e dos reinos orientais, que estaria ligada às questões de soberania sobre o território no sudeste da Europa e a questões também bélicas. Depois aborda alguns aspectos do protocolo que estava envolvido, para que não vou descrever ou tentar resumir, são muitos detalhes, mas passava para uma parte final da conferência que me parece particularmente interessante, pelo menos do meu ponto de vista, que tem que ver com a valorização destas práticas enquanto práticas transculturais, em que, lá está, é preciso perceber o contributo não só dos diplomatas, mas também de toda uma rede que se estabelecia não só em Istambul, mas fora de Istambul, e que é muito difícil de reconstituir porque tinha aspectos de informalidade muito fortes. Estavam abertos também a questões de corrupção, por exemplo, de informalidades várias, mas que eram ao que tudo indica, foram determinantes para a compreensão do desfecho e do funcionamento das práticas diplomáticas. Portanto, acaba por sendo uma conferência que é resultado dos avanços dos últimos anos na historiografia a respeito das relações euro-otomanas. É uma conferência que acaba por também continuar a abrir horizontes acerca deste tema, na medida em que acaba, nas conclusões, por nos abrir, por exemplo, para esta questão dos romanos, que é a questão dos intérpretes, dos línguas, nos impérios e dentro das cortes, continua a ser uma questão sobre a qual há muito que fazer, e é uma questão absolutamente fulcral. Abre também caminho para se pensar sobre a importância de que, neste contexto, teríamos escravos libertos, funcionários de escalão mais baixo, etc., que trabalhavam nesta circunstância. Penso que terminaria aqui o resumo da conferência. Gostava agora de colocar algumas questões à professora Cristiane. I don't know if you could understand my resume.
I don't know if you have actually asked the question.
No, I didn't ask any question. I will pose the questions and then translate them and then...
Fine.
Okay. So, my questions are simple, I think.
Let's see.
So, I was making a resume of your conference, and I was saying how surprising and stunning is this approach when we compare it to the approaches of 30 or 40 years ago, when everything was about war and separate parts of the world. Ottoman Empire by one side making war against Europe defending itself and watching and seeing and considering Ottomans a far danger that should be stopped, and although there was no contact between both worlds. So this kind of view is somehow the position, the Portuguese position during history. I would say you were you made the distinction between two models, two diplomacy models, the Eastern model and the Oriental model. I would say in Portugal and in Iberia, somehow there is a kind of third way of making diplomacy, which was no diplomacy with Istanbul. There was, of course, many contacts through parts like Rome or Venice, but no direct contacts with Istanbul. Only contacts with peripheral parts of the Ottoman Empire. So, one question I would like to pose you was if you found any trace of Portuguese people or diplomats in these documents, because I think it should be very difficult to find, maybe between some lower ranked people.
Yes, but this is exactly the level that is difficult to grasp in the documentation. I'm certain that, there are, for instance, lists of freed slaves or of slaves that want to be freed that arrive in the Palais de France, because the French ambassador was considered the highest ranking Catholic power or Christian power, and so I guess I'm certain that there were Portuguese also who were captured by the pirates in the Mediterranean and who were then brought to the Ottoman Empire as slaves and who wanted to be free. But I didn't, this was not a focus of my research, so I didn't come to them. I didn't see some of them, but let me maybe say something about the commentary that you made, because this is important for me to point out that you said it is interesting how our vision changed from this vision of continuous war now to entanglement and contact and all this. And there's a very good American scholar of this whole history of the shared world of the Ottomans and the Christians in the Eastern Mediterranean, which was Eric Drössler, and a couple of years ago he said we must be careful not to come from one extreme to the other. He named this very famously in a review article between bazaar and battlefield. You know, bazaar is the image of it's all good and we are talking together and we trade, and battlefield, the other extreme. It's both, and we mustn't forget that there was still violent war, there was slavery and all kinds of violence going on. But the thing is that in the discourses, in the way that Europeans talked about the Ottoman Empire and vice versa, there was always this clear delineation. And this is why there's the third variant of diplomacy that you mentioned, no diplomacy, because it was not good for reputation in the Christian world. And the French king experienced this very famously, because his enemies always criticized him for having so close relations with the Ottoman Sultan. And his justification was to say, okay, that's true, but I am in the position to free Christian slaves because I am there. So this plays which is not really an answer to your question,
no,
but
it's
a comment on your comment.
Yeah, regarding that question about France and the idea intellectuals and politicians, some politicians and intellectuals, Catholic mainly, had about diplomacy with the Ottoman Empire. One of the questions I was thinking about was if there is any study, or if you can say anything about the reception of this kind of diplomatic activity, because actually in Portuguese sources, this, of course, the alliance between France and Ottoman Empire is always depicted as a complete disaster that is to blame for the whole division of Christianity and so on.
I mean, there are two strands of intellectual discourse in Europe in the early modern period of this topic. The first is the theoretical treatise on diplomacy and the international law and that is developing at the time in Europe, and it is basically a kind of discussion where they describe practices. And they describe practices in Europe, diplomatic practice in Europe, and they try to establish the norms, the European diplomatic ritual. And in this context, they always depict the Ottoman Empire as the exception. Like other, as they say, Oriental barbaric empires like China or the Mughal Empire in India, they always are described like they don't know how ritual functions, and they so this is the kind of othering that is taking place on the theoretical level. And then there is the second strand of the discussion about the actual, political treaties about international relations, where the states that had a permanent resident ambassador kind of had to justify themselves, like France, as you said. And of course they were very critical, but also, the problem is in Europe was also the confessional divide, because France was the only Catholic. I mean, there was Venice too, but Venice was not a monarchy. And France was the only Christian monarch to have a permanent resident ambassador in the Ottoman Empire. But he claimed to be the patron of the Christians in the Ottoman Empire. This was the role he assumed, and he was talking about the Christian subjects of the Ottoman Empire, the Armenians, the Copts, many other Christian confessions. And this was his way to justify himself. But it was always a polemical issue whenever there was a war between France and another European power. This would come up, and we know that there were, for instance, also very famous caricatures from the time of Louis XIV, who fought many wars, obviously, against also the Habsburgs, and they often allude to his diplomatic relations with the Ottomans in a way as to diabolize them.
So I would have one final question, which has to do with that statement from that Northern American professor who was saying we should not go now from war to bazaar.
Mm-hmm.
Not going from war to bazaar means. Can mean that we should focus mainly on transcultural studies, history made on communities and individuals, or there is a way of doing it through national history like it used to do. Does it mean that we should now focus on histories of communities and individuals?
I think it is a good approach. I think this is the micro-historical approach, and to look how really people deal with one another is a good approach to understand how how intercultural and international relations function. I mean, this other famous saying who says it's not cultures who meet, it's not nations who meet, it's people. It's people who interact, and if we can go on this level, we might have some interesting findings, and then we can generalize. I think it's a good way to focus on the social practices if we want to do global history. Global history does not mean that we focus on the necessarily mean that we focus on the very, very great picture. Global history can mean to focus on very tiny spaces, and it's still global history.
Yes, so thank you.
Baptiste, I see the chat, the first chat came in. The advantages for Turkey of European diplomatic varieties and at European. For Turkey, for the Ottomans, the advantage is clearly that if they manage to divide the Europeans, they can be more powerful. It's easier for them to pursue their own political goals. And we can see, if we look at the 18th century, when the different European powers are more united, we see how much it becomes more difficult for the Ottoman to dominate in the diplomatic negotiations. I think if that is the question, I hope it's I answered this question. For Turkey, and at European. Yes, and for the Europeans, they didn't have really a choice, because they were the guests. They had to be admitted by the Sultan in his capital. This is another thing. You know, when I started, I read out the question. So, considering your presentation, do you agree with Turkey joining the European Union? When I started work on this topic, it was more 15 years ago, I would have said yes, of course. Today, I'm less optimistic, because after all, you know, it's difficult to use history, I think, to really build an argument for political questions of the present. Because history can always be used, and we really witness this right now in the ongoing war with Ukraine. History can be used by everyone the way they want to. And I think we have to look at the international law and at the reign of international law and the norms, the legal norms. And this is, I would always argue that the question that was discussed, is Turkey part of Europe? Of course it is. I mean, the Ottoman Empire was a third of Europe during the early modern. It's part of the European culture. But from there to say they must join the European Union, I'm not even sure they want anymore. I'm not even sure they want anymore. Thank you very much for your comments in the chat. I don't know if I saw all of them. Cici. Thank you very much.
Ok, não havendo então mais questões, dou por encerrada esta sessão. Agradeço muito à professora Christine Vogel a conferência fantástica que apresentou e até um próximo seminário. Obrigado.